And we're live.
Okay.
Okay. It's not recording directly to YouTube or however that works. I haven't looked into it. All right. Hello, world.
Okay.
In case anyone's watching.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. But you're supposed to share the link with the YouTube Hangout community as well, the live stream link.
Got it. Links down here. YouTube page.
It's on the bottom right corner, I believe.
Yeah. Well, that's the YouTube page. That's not the live link.
On the Google.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
On Google one, we share only the read-only video link, so they can only watch it.
I'm putting the join in. All right, so that's already in the VIP. This is the watch only. Where is Google Hangouts? Got it. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, man. And I should get time, depending on how long this lasts. I'll hop back in. So
okay.
Have fun with the world. Give them your wisdom.
Thank you. All right. Okay, I'm just waiting for John to join. We'll just need to edit out the silent part later on in the beginning. Hello everyone. So today we'll be discussing Jordan B. Peterson Biblical Series Lecture 4 and Maps of Meaning Lecture 4. So I wanted to get started with the biggest takeaways for this week. One of the things Peterson talks about is how the discovery of vulnerability. So this starts when Eve eats the apple, and so does Adam, and all of a sudden they know good and evil, and that. Hey, John. John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep. So good that you are here.
Yeah. Is Tyler here too?
Oh, he had to leave, but he will be back to end the event when we ping him.
Okay. Sure.
So you want to get started?
Yes. Why don't we go over our main takeaways from our discussions this week?
Okay, we can do that. I believe I will start the chain of thought that I started before you came.
Okay.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about how Jordan B. Peterson talks about what happens when they eat the apple, that they gain the knowledge of good and evil. And it's been theorized that how that helped uh, us human beings learn the ability to hurt others. Because if I know I'm vulnerable in a way, uh, then I can use that information to hurt others, right?
Yep.
So uh, I have a separate idea on that, which is that I remember that, for example, when I was growing up, people were hurting me, and whenever they were hurting me, I immediately said to myself, okay, so if you do this, people get hurt. For example, when somebody was, for example, insulting me or treating me in a bad way, or uh, doing all other things. So I always remembered that whenever that happened. Uh, and whenever somebody treated me well, and if I felt good, I also remembered that. And I was able to use that information to figure out how to treat others in a way that is fruitful or, for example, respectable. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So uh, our vulnerability also helps us be aware of what other people might find vulnerable, and then when you treat them, you try to accommodate them. To give you a simple example, if, for example, uh, uh, it has something to do with development of like empathy in a human being. Like uh, when we are outside and I'm feeling cold, a friend of mine gives me a jacket, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then I feel very good, and I feel, oh, thank you. So next time when I'm outside and someone else is having that, so I try to help them because I was vulnerable and somebody did something good. I try to follow that. The same goes for the negative events. If somebody treats me in a horrible way, I'll remember it and I try not to repeat that with other people. So I think this argument can be used other way around as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the two side, the double-edged sword of being able to know what other people do that hurts you tells you exactly what you can do to hurt them, or if you understand what other people do that hurts you, it tells you how you can avoid that when in how you treat other people. That's the
Right.
I think the turning of the other cheek, uh, the where you instead of giving an eye for an eye, that'll bring about just it's an ever increasing amount of violence, and I think that's the highest form of virtue is to be is to openly accept whatever pain or whatever is inflicted upon you without responding in a similar manner.
Mm-hmm.
And that that kind of spurred off into a long conversation we had the other day about how much suffering we should try to willingly put it onto our own lives for a good reason, for a purpose that we find uh, something that we want to, something that we feel driven towards.
I never
Yeah.
looked at turning the other cheek that way. That's a really interesting way to look at it, the way you put it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the whole golden rule is interspersed all throughout the Bible. Like I was just reading the other day. I think it's somewhere in Exodus. It talks about be kind to the stranger. Be kind to your stranger because once you were a stranger in the land, and so it's its own kind of version of the golden rule, because at any point we are somebody else's stranger, and so we have to be treating them in the same way that we would want to be treated, because we both understand what it is that we can do that can harm each other.
Right. Apart from that, there is a second thing I wanted to add. So this is about building trust. The idea is that mutual sharing leads to trust. For example, when you initially join a group, you don't know whether or not you are supposed to trust someone or not. You are on your guard. And once one guy, it's like the dominoes falling. So once the first guy starts sharing something like, hey, I had this terrible problem, and here is how I overcame it. So once you make yourself vulnerable like that by sharing that with the team, and it's your judgment as to whether or not you want to do that. And the different people might have different tendencies to take that kind of risk. So once you do that, other people do respond in kind as to say that, you know what, I also had a similar problem and here is how I overcame it. And that's when the deep conversation really gets started. So somebody has to take that step, and we certainly saw that during our discussions in the morning lecture, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that really kind of pointed out to me just what it means when we're not being honest, fully honest with the people that we supposedly love, like our family members. If we're keeping a side of ourselves secret from them, it's essentially what it is you're not trusting them enough to not use your weakness in some sort of harmful way. So that's why we always hide these things inside ourselves, because we're afraid that if we were to share them with the people around us, that the people will take those things and then harness it against us, because that's our flaw that we're sharing with them. And if we're not able to share it with them, it's something that I found myself unconsciously doing. It is saying it's just easier to just not talk about this sort of issue, just because they probably are not going to be responded to it, and it'll just open up a much larger can of worms that I don't want to deal with. But what it actually means is that I'm afraid that they are going to take this flaw of myself, or this idea that I have, and they are going to deride it in some sort of way, or they are going to use that as some sort of way to inflict harm upon myself. I mean, this is all subconscious kind of fear, and it's in some cases a silly fear to have, but it's really, unfortunately, showing me that I have a lot less trust than I should for the people that I I thought that I was fully available to talk with them, but it's something that it'll take me a while to really be able to build up that amount of honesty and trust to be completely open. Because if I'm not able to be completely open with the people that I'm around every single day, then what is that? How am I going to be fully open and honest out in the world with other people that I'm interacting with? How can I be strong enough to resist other people imposing their own opinions onto me, or imposing their own ideas into and taking the ideas that I'm sharing and saying that they're stupid, or by expressing our ideas and our thoughts, even to those that could use those flaws or those ideas, that side of ourselves in some sort of negative way. That's what's going to make us stronger. And that's the beauty of having family, is that they're supposed to not use these flaws that we have against us. And so that allows us to harness the beneficial aspects of a family by also causing us to become stronger. And it's something that I need to work on, that it'll take a while though, and I have to start small. But now that I've recognized my problem, I can try to fix it.
Actually, people have good reasons to not share things with others, because if you are in, for example, like, to give you an example, if you are in kind of a conservative family, at least in India, then there are certain things that you just can't share with your parents. And these are the things that you should have someone to talk with about, so that you don't end up making some serious mistakes.
Yeah. But okay, there's good reasons that you can have for not sharing your open, honest truths with the people that are supposed to not attack you for them. But there's better reasons, I would say, to openly sharing this side of yourself with the people that are you're most familiar with, because they're the ones that are supposed to be with you forever, or not forever, but for your life. And if you're not able to express yourself honestly with them, then you are not going to have the most productive interactions with them. And I totally agree with you. There's plenty of justifications that you can use to not express yourself honestly with them. And because that's what I'm saying, it just opens up a much larger can of worms that you do not want to deal with. But if you're not capable of dealing with it in your own family, then you're not going to be able to be capable of it with anyone else. I mean, if you can't express your ideas with those that may have differing ideas, then how are you going to affect any type of change, and how are you going to keep those ideas? Because if you're always if you're in a place where you're interacting with people that have differing ideas from yourself, then you're going to keep those ideas to yourself and not be able to speak up about them. But with family with different ideas from yourself, that has the added benefit of they are supposed to, if they're a good family, and that's the problem, because if you speak your open, honest truths with your family and they reject you for it, then that's a hard problem to be facing. And but I think it's more, unfortunately, it's more useful for yourself, because every side gets to better understand who each other are and can grow from it. It's that's the thing. It's hard to be honest, because it separates you from people that have differing opinions from yourself, and it separates you from people that you don't want to be exactly separate from. And I don't know. It's something I intend to work on for myself.
Well, I agree with you there, but like my only point was that like when you are living in an environment where I'm talking about in a family, I'm not talking about society. If you have that kind of environment in the society where people are prosecuted against just because, sorry, not prosecuted, persecuted, just because they have differing opinions, then you really, that is a conversation that will lead us into a different direction. But because in that case, you can no longer afford to just stand by and not, fight it.
Are you still on a call? Because Sissy's wanting to hear your experience.
No, I'm still on a call. Sorry.
Okay. But in a family, it's different. If they beat you up for sharing with them that you went out to watch a movie, or you asked a girl out, or you had a date, or you are dating someone, or you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, if they really persecute for you for that, your own family members, and you are not adult yet, you are like still a teenager, for example, then that really makes it impossible for you to honest with those people.
Okay.
So
okay, maybe it's more of being an adult and being honest with them, because as you're growing up, you have that potential to be, well, it's rough, because there's many different varieties of families, and so if you have a bad family, then you don't want to be speaking out your truth, because that can negatively affect you. So you want to kind of free yourself from that before you can fully be honest. But if you have a good family, they are going to be there for you and acceptant of you. And if they end up not being, then that gives you a better, it enlightens you as to things that you did not know before about the people that you thought you knew. And so for myself, I feel I have a good family, and so I need to be honest with them and my struggles and my ideas that differ from them, and just become a person that can fully express himself in a way that's beneficial for myself. Because that's the problem with lying, is it's negative for everyone around you unknowingly. All right.
I think we should move on to the next idea, or
yeah.
I believe I can still add I think I can add one last point, I think.
Okay.
So it's the same thing that is playing out on a larger scale in the society these days, where people feel if they are open and honest about certain topics. For example, all these people who are saying if somebody finds out we are into the Jordan Peterson thing, we could get fired. So, uh, uh, so uh, the interesting thing about being an adult is that you have a responsibility to fight back against something like that. Like you are no longer uh, a kid. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that becomes a entirely different matter. And okay, so yeah, another point was that there is something about uh, having a kind of a. I was reading this book. I forgot the name. He was using the term called racking the shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
I believe as an American, you might be familiar with what that means.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah, okay. So, so this guy went into the this thing bar, and he had this shotgun uh, um, with him hidden in his coat, and it was really kind of they cut off the pipe, so it was really small. And he hides the shotgun behind the under the table, and he was teaching this other guy what kind of people you don't want to play poker with. So and they were in this place where there is music and lights and everything, the club kind of a thing, and so there is a lot of noise there, right? And he racks the shotgun, and immediately there were a bunch of bikers, with their jackets and their tough looks and everything. Immediately they stop and they like look around, even though there was so much noise in that area. So that guy said, you see these guys, you don't want to play poker with these guys. So he was teaching him how to filter out, because his idea was if you want to win in that game, you have to play with people who are going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be able to identify which ones are going to lose. It might sound mean to you, but that was the strategy that this guy came up with. So that applies to this situation like perfectly in a different way, because you might, when you enter a group, you try to assess them initially. Like there was this game where this one guy, he kept losing for first 10 minutes, and then he started winning because for first 10 minutes he was just understanding their strategy or something, right? Uh, so my point is we can do this in an intelligent way. Like we can rack the shotgun, we can share small things with them and see how they react. And if we feel comfortable, we can then end up sharing, much harder things.
Yeah. It's I can see how that analogy works. Like it's sharing, or yeah, sharing your ideas first with those that you think will be most accepting of it, and then moving outwards from there. I think that's what a good family is supposed to be, is those that are more accepting than everyone else, because they have that more familiarity with who you are as a person, so that they can understand you maybe a little bit better than those that don't have that familiarity. All right.
Yeah, okay.
Next point.
Next point. Okay, so one of the biggest takeaways was around the truth. I think you are the one who is most well versed in this thing and the suffering one. So I will defer to you on that.
Okay.
I would
Yeah.
like to add. I would like to add some points on what I would like for you to cover is the part where you are not doing the right things, and then you are doing the things that you don't want to do or shouldn't do by your own set of rules.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So he had talked about living a lie. I'm not even sure exactly where it was in the lecture, but we at some point started talking about what it meant to be living a lie, and that's to be acting out in a way that's separate from your own thinking. So say you have the belief that racial minorities are being unfairly treated by the police. So you have a responsibility to act out that truth that you have in yourself into a way that is working to aid that problem. And so you have a moral responsibility to act in the way that you have been taught, I suppose, not necessarily taught, but every instance that you see around you that has built towards that belief that you have, because that's how we kind of gain all of our beliefs, is by being taught or by witnessing things or by pondering things. That's how we come to the certain beliefs that we have. And so if you also believe that speaking the truth is the most beneficial thing that you can do for yourself and for the world around you, then you have a moral responsibility to act upon your beliefs into a way that is into how you live your life. Because otherwise, as with my first example, and with also I brought up Karl Marx, he suffered through his belief system because he according to everything he had seen, he felt that communism was the most beneficial thing to, well, yeah, communism was the most necessary ideology to take for, or to bring to power or bring to light. And so he had I know I'm taking in all these I'm bringing in examples from the other side just because it's important. He lived out his truth. That's what the truth is for him, is his belief system that had been structured up, and he lived it out into a way that he could fully express it as he understood it to be. And his contribution was beneficial to the whole, even though it wasn't necessarily beneficial to himself as a person, because, I mean, he spent a lot of his time fleeing and living in kind of misery and never really got to see communism's full rise to power and glory. But had he not done that, us here in the future would not understand just how entirely evil or entirely not unsuccessful that ideology is. Because otherwise we could have a new Karl Marx for 2017 that brings about the same type of thing, but now we have a lot more nuclear threat, essentially. So there's, even when you have the wrong ideas that are driving you, you have a responsibility to act out those ideas in how you live your life, because ultimately it will come to greater truth, which is the truth of the future judgment back onto the past. And I believe that's what the judgment of God essentially is, which I'll probably get into a little bit later. But acting out your truth so that you're not living a lie, even when your truth is incorrect, you still have the moral responsibility to act out that truth until you find out that, until you come to a higher understanding. Yeah, that's what I got so far.
I have a slight problem with that. Like, are you saying that Hitler and these other guys? So I see what you mean. Like, it's very much like evolution of ideas, right?
Yeah.
And how they interact with each other, and how the ones that are that have the values will evolve into better, more ideas, right? But I think there is a bound. The interesting thing about being humans is we can implement our ideas inside our own head before going out there and implementing them in the real world.
Yeah.
Right. So when your ideas are leading to other people's death and their suffering, then maybe you should just stop and just maybe in that instance.
How would you come to that conclusion, though, that it would lead to other people's deaths and suffering if you do not act upon your beliefs? It's okay. So imagine there's a lot of people that all think that. No, I don't know why I wanted to bring up an example. I'm terrible at making examples. Okay, in regards to Hitler, I think that's a good point, because I don't believe Hitler acted according to his own beliefs. I believe he was acting as a spokesperson for the crowd, which led onto a feedback loop where he was not speaking what he really wanted to say. He was only speaking what he knew the audience wanted to hear, which is essentially very similar to what Donald Trump does, in that he's a populist he's almost a puppet for the crowd, because when he says something for the crowd that they like to hear, they'll roar with applause. And similar with Trump and with Hitler. I know everyone always brings those two together. But I say it because Trump is someone who has no core beliefs or values of his own. He's only speaking exactly what the crowd wants to hear, and the crowd eats it up. And that system is not beneficial, because in order for a person to be truly individual, they have to differ from the crowd in some sort of way, because otherwise we will, as a society, stagnate with no not revolution, no innovation. If we all did the same thing as the crowd and acted the exact same way, kept to the status quo, there would be no innovation to our society, which would allow us to become more capable into the future. And speaking for the crowd is speaking for anyone besides yourself is actually, I think, the root of evil, or at least one of the roots to evil, because you're acting upon a belief system that is not of yourself, or a system of knowledge which is not of yourself. Because if you personally come to the exact conclusion that you are being harmed in some sort of way, you have a responsibility to act against that harm, or act in a way that could maybe lead to that harm not occurring into the future. But if you are only being told this without actually witnessing it yourself, and without actually realizing the problem and discovering what a proper solution is for that, then forgot how I started this sentence. But the example I'll share is George Orwell with Road to Wigan Pier. He was a socialist, and he was sent out to see the lives of the coal workers, and that was him acting upon his socialistic ideas. Whereas the people that normally, okay, so the majority of the socialists aren't the types of people that interact with the people that they supposedly commit themselves to. But Orwell actually went out there to live with the types of people, understood how they lived, what problems they had, why the solutions that socialism had wasn't working, and he came to the conclusion that we need something else. We need something that is different from what the current solutions have been. I don't see the classic Marxists that teach in a uppity high class college as them acting out their core beliefs, and possibly Marx as well, because he was raised from a bourgeoisie family, and I don't like exact working class experience. He may have. I believe it. His reasoning was probably more from witnessing maybe the hardships that they faced. But interesting enough, all through Marx's life, none of his real ideologies caught on. It wasn't until after his death that they really rose to power, which is unfortunate because he lived a tragic life in that his fatal flaw was not recognized. His fatal flaw being his ideology. But I still believe his life had extreme value because ultimately it has led us as the future race to better understand the dangers of thinking for other people or acting for other people. All right. And I guess I'll go into my thing I had mentioned earlier about how judgment from God is judgment from the future. This was kind of a small thing that I extrapolated quite a bit from Peterson's lecture. I really enjoyed this lecture. It was the biblical one. It's probably my favorite of his. And this is the third time I've seen it. So in the Garden of Eden, God said, "Don't eat of this tree," and ultimately they did eat of it. And then after they ate of the tree, they realized their mistake and regretted it, but unfortunately they could not go back in time to fix that. And of course, I am quite the I really enjoy science fiction, so this is probably why I'm thinking of it more in this four-dimensional reasoning, in fourth dimension being time. So in order to judge somebody's actions, judge somebody's truths that they're living by, Jesus said that you have to judge them by their fruits. And the fruits are what comes from that. And so we can judge righteously. We can judge Marx's ideologies righteously because the fruits that we've seen are not ones that we would like to recur, that we would not like to bring about again. Now you can deny those, but that's not judging very wisely. You could say that the reasons that these ideologies all have failed with millions of deaths is through other means, but it's it's not a very wise judgment, because you're not taking into account the commonality between each of these situations and how each one has kind of led to a more unproductive outcome. And so that's the interesting thing, is we all, okay, maybe we don't all, but we all seem to have a type of conscience within ourselves that is able to kind of tell us the future in a strange way, where, or at least tell us that if we act in this way, it will lead to a negative outcome. And we can try to suppress that conscience that we have, and not, and maybe that's what God at the beginning of the Garden of Eden, telling them, do not eat of this tree. Maybe that's their conscience speaking to them through God, because he has this higher four-dimensional knowledge view set. It's essentially like judging the Marxist ideology based off of the past. We have that aspect of God's ability to understand, to comprehend good and evil, because of this is the other thing that Peterson talks about, is that knowledge of good and evil is the realization of time, because the knowledge of where food is going to be is more valuable than the knowledge of where food is currently. Because if you know where food's going to be, that allows you to farm. And that's the consequence for Adam, is he has to work the field and he has to labor in order to survive. And that's, and also Eve's consequence is she has pain in childbirth, because people's heads, if they have a large enough brain, it hurts to squeeze them out of your, okay, so yeah, that was my main takeaway that I found quite fascinating, is the judgment of God is closely equivalent to the judgment from the future. And that can be in small scale, because you can judge how good or evil you have been based off of the outcomes that you've seen in your own life. And you can use that knowledge to change your ways. And so that's one aspect of having the judgment of God within ourselves. The knowledge of good and evil, the ability to differentiate the two. My other big takeaway, let's see, and we talked a bit about this earlier, was the concept of suffering and the virtue of it, because that seems like a common thread between many of the stories of the Bible, is how much each of the main characters have suffered righteously. Yeah, especially we talked at quite a length about Job, and how my understanding of good and evil now has allowed me to see Job from a new light, because at the end of Job, he gained 7 times what he had lost originally. And so that justified his suffering for no reason. Because we tend to think of suffering as, especially in the Old Testament, we always think of whenever there's suffering that occurs, that it was reasoning we think that whatever suffering that is inflicted upon us is righteous, because it's a consequence of our sin. That's it. But Jesus said, when they had asked him why the beggar was born blind, they asked, was it because of the sin of his parents, or
can you clarify something, John? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
You said something about the person thinking that the suffering is justified, like.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I am. So, in I believe John, yeah, there's this beggar that was born blind, and Jesus's disciples ask him, why was he born blind? Was it because of the sin of his parents or because of the sin of himself? And Jesus responds, he was born blind for the glory of God. And after that, he heals the blind person, proving, essentially creating a miracle out of evil. So there's this, okay, we're always going to suffer in some sort of way. It's the Buddhist motto, life is suffering. And I think our proper response is to take on that suffering, as Peterson talks about quite a bit, taking on as much suffering as we can handle for a good reason, essentially. So since you're going to suffer anyway, you might as well have made all that suffering worthwhile. And I believe that's what Job's suffering was, is he suffered in his entire life, but because he suffered, he gained a great reward, 7 times what he had before had he not suffered. Had he not suffered, he would not have gained the 7 times. And you can think of it as a parable for how we're supposed to live our own lives. In order to gain 7 times what we had before, we have to go through intense suffering. And we have to suffer even when we don't understand why exactly we're suffering. Like, we just have to act righteously and do not deny God, God being our own. Well, there's many different conceptions for God, but if you want to look at it from a secular perspective, denying God would be denying your own self and your own beliefs in truth. So
I'm going to have to stop you, John, because I don't want people to misunderstand what we mean by suffering.
Okay. Yes. Good point. Because there's 2 different types of suffering.
Defined.
Okay. Yes, you can argue there's 3 different types. You go ahead.
Or you can club them into 2. Yeah.
Okay. So there's the suffering you get as a consequence for your actions, which you can see it as sinning. If you act foolishly, you're going to end up in a worse place than you were before. And so that's kind of a consequence of that. That's suffering because of sin. But in the case of Job, and I believe in the case of Abraham and Kierkegaard and Jesus, those are cases of suffering for no previous sin, but suffering in order to gain a high reward. So there's the archetypal story of the dragon and the treasure, or the dragon and the maiden. In order to gain the treasure, you have to go fight the dragon, and the dragon is essentially suffering. That's, or at least suffering and the dragon are related in a sort of way, because you have to suffer somehow or you have to put in effort, hard effort, much harder effort than you would in doing nothing to fight the dragon. And because you've put in that hard effort, be it pain, struggle, emotional hardship, monetary loss, there's many different variants of suffering. So I'll keep it under the umbrella term suffering. And if you're suffering for the correct reason, if you're suffering for your own, under your own truths, then that will lead to a great reward. Now, in the case of Marx, Jesus, and Kierkegaard, that reward is not necessarily going to be gained by yourself, which is the bitter pill to swallow. Because in the case of Marx, the reward that we've gained from his suffering in living out his truths is that we gain the knowledge of how flawed his truths were. And that's why his story is a tragic one, because he didn't understand, he didn't learn from he didn't realize his fatal flaw until it was too late being after he's dead. So he didn't ever really realize his fatal flaw. But we, by reading his work and seeing the outcome, we are able to realize his fatal flaw. So yeah, those are my two conceptions for suffering. What was your third conception?
Okay. What's the word when I decide something by my own will? What is the word for that?
External, unconscious. Okay. Yeah. So the external world inflicting.
No. I take suffering because of my own acceptance. Like I accept the suffering. What is that called?
Okay. So I guess incorporating it into yourself, inflicting the suffering.
The word starts with V. Cannot believe we are having this dictionary argument in front of the word. Voluntary suffering. Voluntary suffering.
Yes. Okay.
When you were talking, I think there are like now 4 subtle categories of suffering, and the first one is self-inflicted suffering. This can work out in multiple ways. The first one, there was this quote from some guy who said, my life is full of disasters that never happened. And there is an English word for that. It's called catastrophizing. I don't know how to pronounce it. What that means is you keep on looking at the future and you keep on predicting doom and gloom for yourself. And in every situation, you assume the worst case scenario or something like that. Now, there is some utility in that, but some people take it to such an extreme level that they are inflicting suffering on themselves for no good reason. The another suffering that is self-inflicted, even though it is because of an external stimuli. For example, if you call me an a-hole, for example, and I start feeling bad, and you call my brother the same, and he starts smiling. So even though the sound originated from you, my brain processed it in such a way that I have inflicted the suffering upon myself. Now, not the Buddhist, this meditation class I attended makes the argument that all suffering is self-inflicted. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to define that there is a way for a creature to behave for him to not unnecessarily suffer by modifying his own thought patterns in a better way. So your own cognition is optimized so that you are not unnecessarily suffering. So let's get that out of the way. The second one is suffering because of a sin, like you pointed out. For secular people, by sin, we don't necessarily mean that you have done something that is against these 4 principles we have and now you should go to hell or something like that. It can be something that is defined by you yourself to be the sin, which is the violation of your own set of rules, or it can be the other definition of sin could be to miss the target. That's what Peterson talks about a lot, that you have decided an aim for yourself and you miss it. And the reason you miss it is because you engage in foolish behaviors. So then obviously you will encounter a lot of suffering unless you get lucky. And you better hope you get lucky in that case. The another suffering is called, there is no book that says these are 4 sufferings. I'm just elaborating them as they come to me. So voluntary suffering would be, I decide certain aim and I decide to chase that aim. And for that, I voluntarily take the suffering. For example, when I go to the gym, boy, it is hard. Or when I'm training for a marathon, it's really, really hard. So, but I still voluntarily accept that suffering because it helps me achieve a goal that gives me meaning, purpose, or maybe I'm such a person that once I decide a goal, I will achieve it no matter what. So then the suffering that comes my way, I'm kind of voluntarily accepting it because it helps me serve my goal, the one that I am after. So suffering, right? The fourth one is kind of a controversial, not controversial, but when we were talking to one of our friends during the private meetings, he said the fourth category cannot objectively be defined because if you are suffering today, we can kind of, I don't remember the exact point he made, but he said something to the effect of we can blame that on you somehow. It's your fault or something like that. Or so by unearned suffering, I would mean the suffering that was inflicted on, for example, Job or Jesus, like not necessarily through their own faults. Now, how do I say this? As far as we humans are concerned, let me put it this way. The fourth category is about suffering because of your limitation as a being.
Yeah.
Like you have not necessarily done anything wrong, but your daughter gets a cancer. Or you are not able to save someone when you are supposed to, or all the other suffering we go through because we are limited beings. So that is kind of an unearned suffering. Now you could still make an argument that 10 years ago you kicked that dog and that's why your daughter has gotten cancer or something like that. You could, but I think I'm not able to exactly pinpoint the exact definition of the fourth one, but I still do feel that there are times when through no fault of your own, a lot of suffering is inflicted upon you. So the reason I am dividing them in the category is because not all of them are about this redemptive force that you were talking about. Like for the
Sorry. Yeah.
For example, in the first example, if you interpret everything that comes your way in a negative way, then you will eventually end up killing yourself. So I don't see the redemptive power in that, or you can correct me. What do you thought about that? Because I think your argument about gaining something from the suffering have something to do with the type of suffering that we are talking about.
Yeah, I think I really enjoy your description of the fourth one, of your suffering from your own limited being. So we as humans, we are destined to die, or whenever we hit maybe 90 on average. I think actually the average is somewhere in the 70s, but we're all destined to suffer a death, and so that's one. I probably shouldn't say so, but we're all destined to die. So, and the reasoning for that is because of our own limited capabilities. Because I mean, we're humans; we don't live forever. And I think your first example also fits under that category, but it's not limited in the same way, because if you're a hypochondriac that will always interpret everything that happens to you as something that you were always going to get, you were destined for this type of pain to always be, and there's nothing that you can do with this pain. That's an aspect of your own limited mind, I suppose, because you're unable to learn from your mistakes and be able to move into the second type of suffering, which is accepting that suffering and brushing it off as into a way that's not going to affect your other life. So maybe you may have, through your fourth description, defined each of the previous three, because we're all limited beings and we all suffer because of that. But okay, so in the case of Job, he suffered because he was a perfect being, but still not God. That's essentially God's reasoning when he's talking back to Job is, are you the one that created the heavens and the earth? Are you the one that can cause everything to cease to exist? You're not God, so you're going to be suffering no matter what. You better get over it, essentially. But because of that suffering, without failing, without denying God, I don't know. The Job story is such an interesting one, and it's one that can be looked into further. And I think it gets kind of brushed aside by, I don't know. I used to brush it aside, so I'll say that. Brush it aside in the sense that I didn't understand it exactly, but I think I have a larger viewpoint of it. Okay, so if we are to willfully accept the suffering and to act despite the suffering, act according to our truths, then that will lead towards a reward. Now, in the case of Kierkegaard and Marx, the rewards are gained posthumously, so after they've died, but there's still a necessary and useful reward that has been gained from their suffering. So oh man, this is so ridiculous, but okay, Marx went through a similar amount of suffering as Christ, but from an opposite reward, an opposite consequence. So from Christ's suffering, we learn so much. In fact, I'm not even exactly sure just how. Okay, from Christ's suffering, we learned a ideal example to strive towards in our lives for the rest of humanity, and it also has given us a freedom from assuming that we will always sin. We have an example to strive towards through Christ's suffering. In Marx's suffering, we gain an example to not strive towards, essentially. But they both suffered according to their truths, and only through the judgment of God are we able to comprehend whether their suffering, whether their life was, their life was definitely worth it. But the thing is, it's only once we see the end point of their lives that we can judge whether it was a comedy or a tragedy. One that ended with a happy ending, or one that ended with the tragic character not learning their fatal mistake. So both are entirely useful for us. Not ultimately useful, but, well, yeah. Both are extremely useful for us as the future versions looking back into the past. We gain a lot of insight from looking back onto both of those stories, and also with the case of Kierkegaard, who suffered and wasn't able to sell many of his books, and also was mocked by his compatriots, but he still had this kind of inner conscience that told him that what he was doing mattered, and he continued to do it despite what the crowd around him was saying. That's accepting of suffering. did Hitler go through that suffering of shame from the crowd? Okay, so Marx, in his case, he continued to reject the crowd and living in his suffering, whereas Hitler, he accepted the derision or the guide of the crowd and fed back onto the crowd into a way that made them more violent and more evil. And so I don't know. It's hard to. Okay, I think I'm going to stick with that example of we're able to judge the effectiveness of suffering based off of the end point. The suffering was a worthwhile tragedy for us to witness, or or a worthwhile comedy with a happy ending that we were able to witness. And maybe that's kind of like that verse that says, somewhere in the New Testament, it's about like, beware of everything you do, for you unknowingly entertain angels. It's that idea that if we act in a way as if everything we do is seen by others, because ultimately it could be seen by others, by the future looking back onto the past to see what was effective and what was ineffective. We have a responsibility to act according to our own belief system, our own truths that we have learned, and we have a responsibility to harshly judge our own truths to be sure that they are worthwhile and to continue in them.
There is a comment from the audience.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm authorized to like disclose the name of the person, so I would not.
Okay.
So it says that it's a really interesting quote, and I believe Peterson had a whole lecture on it in I believe it was in 2000s. So it says voluntary suffering also means to stop ignoring the dragons that are already there. When going to the gym, you are basically creating a new dragon from setting an aim. Yes. So that's the So the voluntary suffering has two categories now. So it's interesting how these things keep happening to us. So the one would be creating new dragons. Because you have set an aim, so you have created a new dragon. So that's part of your voluntary suffering. The another part of voluntary suffering, as per this comment, is to stop ignoring the 10 dragons that are hiding in your room already.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, like, I see suffering Suffering is the umbrella term that encompasses all of these different examples. And I see them, how suffering can be either or all the time. So, like, if the dragon is you have a poor heart that is not very capable as a muscle, the dragon that you can try to be conquering is to exercise more so that you can make your own heart stronger, which is essentially what all suffering is it's making you more capable in some sort of way. That's what effective suffering is. If you're suffering in silence and by doing nothing, that's an indication that you're limited, and so you have a responsibility to somehow try to somehow try to break out of your own limitations. And so that's what Stephen Hawking did. That's what the motivational speaker that you brought up the other night with that was born without any arms and legs. Don't remember.
I believe it was you brought him up.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So in the case of Stephen Hawking, he could just live out the rest of his life doing nothing. and essentially have become a burden to everyone around him. But he instead took upon that suffering and turned it into an asset for himself. I think he said that his own condition has given him much more free time to ponder and to think clearly upon things. And so that's how he's, I don't want to say that's how he has, but it has allowed him to hone his own skill that he had previously, or to create new skills into a way that is still effective. I don't think I can say anything more on this subject myself.
Oh, that's how you have me.
Yeah.
There is this is just like a baby idea which is not even born, like it is stuck.
Yeah.
I don't want to say any names. It's stuck in the canon. So I think there is something to be said about the quality. How do I say this? Quality of suffering, because there are two ways you can suffer. This goes back to the point about having the voluntarily accepting the current dragons and fighting them, right? So that's the voluntary suffering. So that's your one option. Another one is to keep ignoring them, and then they'll get bigger and bigger and bigger, and one day they'll get so bigger that they will eat you, or you will essentially kill yourself. People do that.
Yeah.
Because
they can't
from every and it's not an easy thing to even like I know people who say that's the easy way out, you are a bunch of cowards and stuff like that, but it's a really hard thing to happen to anyone. So I would say the person who is suffering, trying to fight those dragons and failing every day, and this certainly happens during addiction, that you try to fight it, you fail, you relapse, you fight, you fail, you relapse. So it can be a 5-10 year process, even longer than that. So on the one hand, we have that guy who is doing that. On the other hand, we have this guy who is not fighting his dragons and therefore suffering. So I would say the former is more admirable kind of a suffering rather than the later. That's my first thing that I would say to you. And this goes back to the second point I was going to make, which is now like connected to this point, which is that there is something to be said about, again, it's the same point. I don't know why it seemed different to me. There is something to be said about reason. I guess it is slightly different point. Reason because of which you suffer, and not just the outcome. And let's just say, again, last time you defended that by saying people who witnessed you got influenced. So that was the one good thing that came out of it. But I'm still not satisfied. Like, what if you did the best you could, you followed your truth, and you ended up totally desolate and like dead and totally just, and so then we don't have a happy ending. So in that sense, is his suffering still worth it? So I would say you've got to ask yourself a question: what were the reasons, like, because of which he was suffering? And reasons, not in the sense that what the reasons people had who were hurting this person. Reasons in the sense that how noble, because we are always trying to defend some principle or attain some goal. So what was that thing he was defending? And if that thing is admirable, then I would say, even though the outcome was not very good, okay, let me put it this way. let's just say you live in a society that does not value free speech and extremely religious, and if you spoke up uh, uh, against the religion or something, they will behead you or something.
Yeah.
So now that sounds like a tragedy, but that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at that tragedy is the reason because of which he suffered was so no. It goes back to that point about that guy who stood in front of the tank in the China. But then that had some positive angle to it, because Western media picked it up and they kind of turned it into a big uh, symbol of some one standing against these people. But what if nobody really cared? People came and all of them started shouting, kill this person, and then they killed you. So nothing much came out of that. So how would you, back to you.
Okay, yeah, and this goes into a side point, which I think is still related, that I kind of come to the conclusion that there's an evolution process of ideas, which is that there are many different peoples and situations that come up with their own truths that they have that are very unique and different to each other. And these truths can try to come out by the individuals and will be and these truths can be can change and evolve over time, but in certain cases they will still fail or they will still die, and the reasoning for why they die is to prove the other truths as more accurate. So this is, man, it's a tragic thing to have to say, but there are certain countries that behave off of a specific ideologies, and the individuals within those countries will try to speak out their truths that they have, or will try to act in the way that they believe, and are ultimately killed for that. In this certain case, I'm thinking of North Korea, but there's many other ones, too many other ones. Probably there's an aspect of it within every country. So it goes back to your point that there's a limiting factor to be proven by our suffering. So if we see that we are suffering, that proves that there is some sort of dragon that is inflicting the suffering. And that is a dragon that should be conquered. And we ourselves may not be capable of defeating that dragon, but we still have a responsibility to defeat the dragons that we are capable of, because that will lead us to a place that we may become more capable. So in the case of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he suffered and he went through extreme hardships in order to get his book written. And the reward for that book being written is the defeat of the dragon. And ideally, the ability to not have that dragon come up again. Now, of course, there's still remnants of that dragon that need to be conquered. But in his specific case, that dragon of communist Russia was at least crippled in a way that could be then taken down by fellow warriors, fellow knights that are taking on that dragon. So his book, the Gulag Archipelago, could have been a strong, and I think there's a good case to be made that it was a strong blow towards the dragon that along with many other blows brought that dragon down. Now, yeah, that's that point, I guess.
And the reason the reason he was able to do that was because he asked himself that how is he responsible for his suffering?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. He was searching within himself to find that limiting factor that he contributed to cause the suffering. And I believe that's what a kind of example can be taken from the death of Christ, is he had died for the sins of his culture, from the sins of every aspect of his species that has built up and brought him. Okay, so it's essentially a similar story to King David, who saw Bathsheba bathing and ordered her husband to be killed in battle. And because of that, his son that he had gained from sleeping with Bathsheba was killed by God. So that's the innocent suffering because of the sins of the father, or the sins of the culture, because generally the father is very closely tied to the culture that we have around us. And so Jesus's death was a death for the father's case. He was taking on that suffering for the sins that had come about because of that had come about before him. And in a similar case with Solzhenitsyn, he was suffering and he was fighting against that suffering in order to gain a reward. It's so fascinating to look at everything with a dragon, hero, reward kind of perspective, because in certain cases it seems like there is no reward to be gained, but the reward that could be gained is that this dragon is a lot more powerful than we may have imagined. And it's unfortunate that the reward that people suffering it, that the minute reward that people suffer for leads to, but it could be just a large amount of people suffering leads to a large amount of casualties, or a large number of deaths, which is a larger indicator of how powerful this dragon is and how important it is to defeat this dragon.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. So that will draw the warriors from the remote corner of the world to say, man, this is some dragon, we have to kill it.
Yes. And it's the duty of the knights to seek out these dragons that they've witnessed. Back to Marx and Kierkegaard and all the others that I've mentioned, to attempt to defeat that dragon. But of course, I don't know. This is still off the top of my head. There's something definitely to be said of defeating the dragon within your own presence first. So cleaning your room, taking the splinter out of your own eye before, or taking the log out of your own eye before attempting to take the splinter out of another's eye, because capacity for dealing with the dragon that's within your own backyard than you do for dealing with the dragon that's in somebody else's backyard. So don't go throwing stones until you're perfect. which is going to take a while. Okay, that's okay.
No,
Actually,
you are not done yet here.
Yeah.
This is going to, I think this suffering thing is going to continue till midnight.
Yep, that's a good, because I actually do have more that was from this lecture that is based off this subject still. It's the most important subject ever, probably.
Yeah, because I'm dealing with suffering of my own right now.
Yeah, it's something that every single person has ever dealt with. So it's very important to get right, to comprehend it.
I think I finally got the. I think I finally got the key thing in this topic, which is that and it was the thing that our anonymous friend pointed out in the Bible discussion, that we are focused too much on suffering. I forgot the point he made, but the one that comes to my mind is we are focused too much on suffering, but not on the quality of truth because of which you are suffering. And here is what I mean by that. The terrorist training in Afghanistan, right? They go through enormous amount of pain and suffering. And then when they walk into the shopping mall, that's like you killing yourself for some cause or something. And I mean, can you imagine doing that yourself? Like, it must take, that's just you confronting your own existence like that, like just end it and end these people. So you can say that these people go through certain amount of suffering, right? So now, on the other hand, someone who is trying to stop them might go through similar amount of suffering as well, right? Now, it's not so much as suffering itself, it's also about the quality of the truth or the quality of the cause that you serve. And it goes back to that other point where Peterson was talking about how you come up with an aim and you follow it. It doesn't matter if it is the incorrect aim. As you pursue it, you are supposed to refine it. You are supposed to figure out where you are really supposed to go. And the place that you end up going is nowhere like the place that you initially had imagined, because on the journey you kept on coming up with new versions of the truth, right? So yes, you do follow your truth and you suffer because of it, but if you are unable to refine that at a higher level continuously, then there is a big problem there. So
yeah. So I've gotten the going back to the Buddhist, I guess, saying life is suffering. That leads me to, if life is suffering, then death is the end of suffering. And if your goal is the end of suffering, that leads to death. Because there's always going to be some sort of suffering. It's our goal should be to make sure that that suffering was worthwhile and has led to a better outcome than previously. So, and oh gosh, man, it's hard to come up with some objective truth that is useful for every single instance, because every single instance has potential outcomes that lead to differing objective truths about whether or not it was good or evil. But I do think that the infliction upon people to end their suffering could be considered evil. Because, okay, in the case of a divine creature that is aware of their own suffering, and this is still a concept that I'm not fully fleshed out on, because I have my own justifications for eating meat, and that's part of it, but I have no real basis for these justifications that I can understand as of yet. I'm still in the process of comprehending my own moral code as well as my own understanding of the external world and how it relates to that moral code. Another side aspect of suffering that was brought up to me this week through the book I'm reading currently by Eric Neumann, The Origins and History of Consciousness. He goes on. He brings up this point about animal sacrifices, actually, coincidentally enough, and about the functionality of these sacrifices, even when they're not being accepted by a certain deity, even if they weren't accepted by a certain deity, it's different from how you might imagine the functionality of animal sacrifices. Well, I'm going to just use sacrifices in general because it's relevant to more points than in the case of sacrifices for animal sacrifices, because it's something that's kind of done away with in our own society, but it's still an important point that should be acknowledged, despite the differing methods of sacrifices that we have in our own day-to-day life. So I'll just use sacrifices, but in his case, in his point, he was referring to animal sacrifices. The sacrifice that brings forth more reward is not because of necessarily the deity that they're offering it to. Now, of course, that this is from his own perspective, so I'm going off of that for right now. The effectiveness of the sacrifice is that it comes from the subjective sacrificer, in that it makes them more capable to handle that sort of sacrifice than had they not sacrificed this side of themselves or this aspect of themselves. So I'll go to the case of the Jews, because they don't use animal sacrifices currently, but they do still do their sacrifices of tithing. So there's this practice of giving away a tenth of every bit of money that you make. In the case of the Bible, it was given to the priesthood, given to those that are poor, those that are needy, the widows, the childless, the churches. Essentially, that's what tithing is to give away a tenth of everything that you make. And the effectiveness of that sacrifice is that it creates the person that is capable. It creates a person that is capable of making those sacrifices without failing. So I'm going back to animal sacrifices just because that's a little bit more easier to understand, because it was a harsher world back then. Say you have 10 sheep in your pasture that you have to feed and take care of for a whole year. And whenever you... in the cases of animal sacrifices, it was usually used for a consequence of sin, but it's also useful as in praise for God or worship of God, and also for different holidays there would be sacrifices, and usually the meat would go towards the priesthood, and because they had their own struggles that they had to go through. So if you have only 10 sheep and you sacrifice one of them, and that causes it so that you can only sell 9 sheep that year, and that means you don't have enough money to take care of your sick family, you will ultimately die. So the way to deal with that sacrifice is to raise 100 sheep. Then you can sacrifice 10 of them or give them away to the Levitical priesthood at that time. And you now have 90 sheep, which you have you're much more capable of selling and spending on your family. So Eric Weinstein, he was on the Joe Rogan podcast. He had said that he had theorized that the Jewish religion was evolutionarily beneficial, which caused most Jews to be the most influential people in the world. So in the cases of like, I think he was saying like 40-something% of Nobel Peace Prize winners are Jewish. There's, I'd say maybe 40% of the richest people are also Jewish. The higher ups in Hollywood, those are all, not all, but primarily Jewish. There's this effectiveness of sacrifice that forces the individual making the sacrifice to work harder and out of necessity. You have to work 110% harder than you would normally in order to in order to just gain 100%. That's where that term giving 110% came from. It's an impossible thing, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. Also, in the cases of the Sabbath, the seventh day is the one in which you rest. 6 days you labor, and the seventh you shall rest. That is another sense of sacrifice, because if you only have 6 days to get all of your labor in order, then that causes that it's beneficial in 2 ways, because it gives you a day that you can rest, a vacation day, just like in the case of Archimedes, when the king had hired him to discover the weight or the volume of gold or something like that. And it was only after he sat down into his bath and saw the levels rise in the water that he said, "Eureka!" and came up with a solution for how to test the density or I think of gold or whatever the problem was that he had. Only through our relaxation are we only through our relaxation are we more capable to comprehend our own surroundings. That's what we're doing when we dream. We take in all of the problems that we face during that day and from all of the previous experiences in our life and aggregate them into something that is functional and can be useful to us if we interpret it. And also sleeping. If you don't sleep, you're going to die within, I think it's like, within a week or so, maybe. It depends on the person, really, but most people without sleep will go insane. There's an actual illness that's called familial insomnia. It's something, fatal familial insomnia, which is where you're incapable of sleep and you see hallucinations and your mind goes crazy, and you either end up killing yourself or just die out of exhaustion. So there's that necessity for relaxation that drives both innovation, and it also drives, well, I'd say innovation conquers both of the terms, because it forces you to work harder during the 6 days you labor in order to catch up. There's this funny quote from The Office where Michael's justification for movie Monday was that it caused the people in the office to work faster. And his boss asked, now, why is that? It's because they have to in order to get all the work done in time. So it's...
What moving Monday? What moving Monday?
Oh, yeah, it's this American television show where the boss of the office is kind of incompetent, and so he loves this specific movie, and they were watching like segments of it there in the office, and for like about 15 minutes or 30 minutes or something like that. And so then the rest of his justification to his own boss was that it caused the group, the rest of the office, to work harder, and because they had to in order to get all the work done that they missed while watching the movie. It's a funny example, but it's so yeah, that's the functionality of sacrifice, of voluntarily accepting suffering upon yourself and overcoming it. That's what it means to be a hero, is to voluntarily take on as much suffering as you can accomplish. No, it's voluntarily taking it on as much suffering as you can and overcoming it. That seems to be the similarities between all classifications of heroes. And then there's the tragic main character, which isn't necessarily a hero because they don't overcome it, but they can still attempt to overcome it, and we do see heroicness in that. So in the case of, oh man, I recently watched Dunkirk. I guess it wasn't that recently, it was probably like 6 months or so ago, maybe even longer. Dunkirk by Christopher Nolan. And I ended up crying for about 30 minutes after the movie ended because of each individual in the film, despite the outcome. It was there. You're right. There is a heroic nature to attempting to overcome suffering, even if you fail. There is the attempt that is regarded as heroic and worth continuing, and worth idealizing, and worth attempting to take that example upon yourself and to work towards it. It's something worth, in a sense. Like that movie is fantastic, and that true story of Dunkirk is as well, because it's people overcoming their own limitations and their own responsibilities, because there's many of the individuals, the fishermen and the villagers, that had no responsibility of fighting in this war, but they, despite their own lack of responsibility, they took on that responsibility and acted in a way that helped bring in, oh man, I don't know the statistics, but it was like 10 times what was planned on actually achieving. It was incredible.
What was the movie?
Dunkirk. It's by Christopher Nolan. It was released last year sometime.
Yeah. I know. I'm recalled of instances in India where when I was growing up, I was always looking up to America, and America always was putting its leg in here and there. So So from that, I got the idea that you are supposed to intervene. You are not supposed to just watch and let bad things happen. You are supposed to get involved. Even though different people have different perspectives on that, as to some people like Trump would say, if our presidents had only gone to the beach and done nothing, Middle East would be a great place. He actually said that. So whenever I would insert myself into situations where I did not have to, because I was not the target of the suffering or the attacks. The other side would always say, like, why do you care? Like, you are not the target of this suffering, so this is none of your business. So that I have heard that argument a lot. This one time I was at the university and there was some supposedly unethical stuff going on, and I was literally told by a management person that when you are the target of this incorrect behavior, then you come to me and complain. As long as someone else is the target, you don't complain. The person who is actually target might not complain for whatever reason, like nobody wants to get into trouble. So it is so strange.
Yeah, that's something I'm still trying to figure out, is when to take on the responsibility of fighting for another person's to aid their suffering, because there's detriment in doing that in the case of fighting for somebody that. And okay, so we were discussing the book Toxic Charity that I had recently read, and about how just giving money to those that are poor and needy can have a consequence on the person that you're giving money to, because it changes their behavior and their mentality into a way that thinks that their only use is to be a beggar. The only effective use of their time is to become a beggar and to wait for the handouts of others, which is not something that we should be wanting upon these people. It's something we want them to overcome their suffering that they are in. So maybe that's the holdover, is to, you can fight or you can try to aid in the suffering of others in order to help them overcome their own suffering in some sort of way, which, yeah, at least their suffering that they are facing most prominently at the time. It's still something that I need to fully act out and understand where the faults are in my thinking are, and I don't know, it'll take me a while to get right.
I'm not specifically talking about aiding them, because that is a yes, you're right about that. You have got to expect certain degree of self-reliance from people. I was more or less talking about, but then it does tie into what you were saying, but not exactly. Suppose someone is being dealt with. Yeah. Suppose someone is facing a great deal of injustice in the society, maybe because of their caste, or and let's just say you have certain degree of power or privilege, or maybe you don't, but you are one of those agreeable people that you just don't want to play poker with those guys, right? So then it was more or less about because in certain situations, John, the difference between the competency of the people who are getting hurt, and the competency that is needed to raise a voice is so huge that other people need to come in and start fighting and to set the society straight. Let me put it this way. I'm talking more in the sense of teamwork to defeat a bigger dragon.
Yeah, and I think I've just come up with kind of a solution, or at least a methodology for how to deal with this problem. Is in the cases of catastrophe, such as with a hurricane or a flooding, or in the case of Dunkirk, I think our responsibility, and in the case of the poor and needy, our responsibility is to act on their behalf in a way that we only have to do once. So, yeah, that doesn't cause them to become a dependent. No, it doesn't cause them to become dependent upon others, but it causes them to step out of their hole and to allow them to become independent, so that they know if we're helping them properly, we only have to aid them once. We don't have to continue to feed them, or we've done whatever it is we can to help them become more capable over themselves. That seems like a good, at least that seems like a currently good methodology to follow off of.
That's just the probably I don't want to use like huge words, but that's like really remarkable thing I have heard when talking to you guys. That's exactly right. Your solution should be something you only have to do once. That just remind me of all these reforms and legislations have taken place. Even in my own country, there has been many issues like, let's not get there. But anyways, my point is, yes, that does make a lot of sense, that do something that you only have to do once, even though doing that might take years and multiple stages of fighting reforms over and over again. But yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Because to do it any other way is the easier way. If you were to just give away, say, $20 to somebody that is poor beside you, that's easier for yourself. It's easier for the beggar. It's the easier method, and that's why it's important to try to take on suffering, as much suffering as we're capable of, for a good purpose, for a reward that we deem worth suffering for. So if you're, it's okay. So here's a example, or not example. It's just a different perspective, I suppose. The people that give freely to those that are needy don't care about them as much as the person that trains them or gives them a job that they are capable of continuing to feed their family on their own volition. It's so the people that think that they care for the poor more so, or for those that are in need, are actually caring for them in an easier way. They don't care as much for them because they're taking the easy route. This is primarily what I've gotten from reading the book Toxic Charity. Let me find the author for that, because that's a very important book. It's by Robert Lupton.
Can you show me the cover? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good book. Very quick too. I read it in a week. So, and it's written by a Christian too. So I think it's an effective means for sharing the message, because I think I brought this up the other night, that Ayn Rand's books are, she's such a disagreeable person that anyone that is high in agreeableness instantly basically will reject her work. Like I had a couple of kind of socialist, or at least left-leaning friends, that they would kind of disparage Rand's work at pretty much any chance that they got. So I think that this is coming from the right place, because it's wanting to help people step out of the hole that they found themselves in on their own. But it's not like they're in a hole and I'm going to throw some food in for them, and they keep throwing food in for them every single day of their life and my life, and until I die. And then what are they going to do? They're still going to be in the hole. Who's going to help them then?
I think Ayn Rand is more for these grassroots kind of people, like people who are really dealing. Let me put it this way: people who are at the very front lines of their struggle with the society, because they are trying to do things that are different. I think they find a lot, because for them it's about like war. I think they find a great deal of inspiration in that.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed The Fountainhead. I'm intending to read Atlas Shrugged at some point within the next couple months. I have a long list of stuff I need to get through, but I enjoy her work, and I do believe that the objectivist philosophy is probably one of the closer, it's one of the higher resolution ideologies that is worth using as a stepping stone to get out of. Well, okay, that it seems like a put down, more of a pejorative, but in the case that, like, each of these kind of isms, objectivism, socialism, veganism, these are all kind of singulated forms of being. I don't know if that's a word, but it sounds right. That the world is more complicated, and thus needs to be treated in its more complicated form, that any of these ideologies are incapable of fully dealing with every single problem in the world. But I do believe that objectivism is probably one of those philosophies that is quite useful, and especially for living in the present moment. That is probably one that is, a lot can be gained from the objectivist philosophy. I'll just end it on that.
Yeah. I just want to make a point and then we can move on.
Sure.
Because we have pretty interesting points.
Uh-huh.
But then if I say this, then discussion will start. But I'll note it and we can discuss it later.
No, I'm finished with the all of my topics of suffering that I can speak on.
No, my idea was about the Rand thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that pushes people away from her work is it sounds so heartless.
Yeah.
It's easy for me to grapple even as someone who likes her work. So other things, even though, damn, I knew this was going to, even though if you dig down, it is more compassionate than, I would love to talk to you about that someday.
Yeah, I can see kind of your point, that it's a more compassionate. Okay, so let's go back to the example of, there's somebody that's inside of a hole, and there's the socialists that will walk by, throw some food into the hole, and then continue continue to walk by. The objectivist will pass by the person in the hole entirely, so that it forces the person in the hole to either die in the hole or to step out of the hole, and it is heartless. I hopefully there's some sort of middle ground where we can help the person out of the hole and allow them to be able to help other people out of the holes that they find themselves in. Okay. I think those were all of my main takeaways from our discussion.
Just one question for you. What must be the time in Florida right now?
I'm not in Florida. That's Tyler. I'm in Missouri. So it is 12:18.
But you are an American. You must have some idea.
Oh, in Florida? Yeah, it would just be 1 hour ahead. So it's 1:18 p.m. for him.
Oh, thank God. Okay. And is it the Christmas yet or what?
No, Christmas starts, it's Christmas Eve. So yeah, that won't be until evening time. So, but
okay, got it. Yeah. Okay. So it's still 24.
Yeah.
Good. Because we have to contact him to end this podcast.
Oh, okay, great.
So it cannot be 3 p.m. over there and he's sleeping. And okay, so I want to move to the next point. This is a big problem. Not doing things you want to do. You decide you want to do something during the weekend, or you want to pursue some goals, or you want to hit the gym, and then you don't. Mm-hmm. If you are not hitting those targets, in that sense you are sinning, then what must you be doing? Well, a hell lot of time you are just doing the things that gratify you in the present, right? But a hell lot of other times you are doing things that you actually don't want to do. You know that I'm not supposed to be doing this, but you just can't stop. So this has been, and once I started about talking to people about this, people say, hey, I also have this problem. I also have this problem. How many? And it just, I mean, it doesn't make sense. Obviously from my experience, I can tell it makes sense because it actually happens. So there must be some sense somewhere in it, but it does not make any sense as to, it sounds so self-defeating as to, if it wasn't so, if I hadn't seen it, I might actually not have believed it. Let me put it this way, that people could do something like this. And so you are, do you have anything to say on that?
Okay, so it's the struggle of avoiding the things that you don't want yourself to be doing. Yes? Like how to do that, which is, I can't speak entirely on it, but I have something to say, I think. So I do believe in free will, but from my own perspective and my own current self, I see that I have a very weak will. And I found that in order to defeat my own limitations with that weak will that I have, the most effective methods that I've seen is to change my external world to keep me from relying upon my own weak will. And so this is something I need to go further on, but since I guess currently I've kind of been doing it unconsciously, but recently, the last few days, I well, not last, like the last week, I would write out my entire schedule for the day, and then like every single thing that I want myself to do, and by the hour. And so after, as the day goes on, for each of those hours, I will put my entire focus into that task that I want to accomplish. And I usually don't accomplish as much as I would want from each of those tasks, but it is keeping me productive because it is focusing my energy into this one task that I want to get done, and I'm making progress on these tasks, even though I'm not exactly finishing them. But I'm making progress on many different tasks that I want to make progress on, which is ideal. Had I not had this schedule, I would probably, and I have, because based on my own self-reflection and by keeping this schedule, I noticed that I will devote all energy into accomplishing a task and then getting a lot done, but also doing it in a foolhardy way. So just the other day, I wanted to finish reading a friend of mine's manuscript for a first draft of a book she had written. And I had planned on spending my entire day of doing that, and I was also going to give notes. Because I had devoted my entire day to doing it, I ended up writing way more notes than I had intended to do. And it ended up only progressing me about like 5% of the way through the book when I had intended to finish the book by that day. So I had, in the case of failing in regards to stumbling according to addictions and other vices that we have, I've found that I'm most susceptible to falling into those vices when my external world lines itself up to make those vices easy to do. So, and the day after that, I had the day off from my work, which is I usually do all my kind of side goals and stuff during my job at work. And so that next day, I didn't have to wake up early, and I had masturbated that night, which I had intended not to do. The reasoning for that was because I had given up my own self structure that I had for myself, that I should have had for my next day. And that had given me the free will to fall back onto my own vices. And it seems like the best way to, as I was saying, it seems the best way to become the person that you want to be is to change the world around you into one that it makes that person easier to be. So in the case between you and I, we have our daily calls that we go over our schedules for what we intend to do in the day and whether or not we've accomplished that. And that's holding myself, and I'm assuming yourself, to a higher accountability for what we're doing than if we had just kept that under an individual responsibility. We somehow share this kind of communal responsibility between each other that it makes us stronger. So, and that's another aspect of Ayn Rand, that it underplays the positive effects of communal individuals. I mean, in the Fountainhead, he has his friends that they're all individuals with, and they all work kind of together to create the one place. I can't remember exactly from the Fountainhead, but it was this beautiful like cabin area of cabins around this out in the middle of nowhere for people to kind of get work done on their own. And so if you're okay, now how to change that external world to best suit you is something that will take a long time to figure out, and it will take me a long time to figure out. Hopefully I can do that sooner rather than later, but it's something I need to work on.
Yeah, that's I have to complete the circle now.
Mm-hmm.
So in Eastern, it's more about conquering yourself. So if you can conquer yourself and have the environment optimized towards that, then we can really have like double the growth.
Yeah.
And
that's the funny kind of difference between Western point of view and Eastern point of view, because the Western is always trying to change the world around them,
right.
And the Eastern point of view is to try to stay conscious and in the moment of the world around you and enjoy the world that you have currently. It's two very differing viewpoints that are best suited together. You're right, I believe.
Yeah. I will show the audience, for the audience sake, that picture that we talked about a long time back about from the Bhagavad Gita.
Okay.
So
oh yes,
see it, right? So
yeah.
you got the horses, which represent our senses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the back we got two people. The passenger would be the guy who is what's the right term for this? Driving the horses is the mind, and the individual is the passenger. So it's really interesting how they distinguish between the mind and the passenger, which is you. But again, it's about these horses, right? They have their own personalities and they want to go in their own directions, and so they are not necessarily in control of the mind. So it's about enhancing your mind to have better control over them, so that you can actually go where you want to go. Otherwise, there'll be, I think that's part of the problem, because we are way too, how do I say this? You would find many people, and I believe I am one of them, who, when they look at the hot girl, they were off to do something totally different, but they see really hot girl on the street, and all of a sudden they are having all these thoughts, and they come home, and rather than working, they are still thinking about that. So in a way, we are kind of slave of the inputs that come, and I found meditation is a great helper in these situations of having greater control over your impulses. That was part of the.
Sorry, go ahead. No.
That was part of the reason I was able to overcome my addiction to internet pornography. After I started meditating regularly, and I had this 10-day retreat, and I could not put my finger on it, like what happened. Obviously, there must have been many factors. But when our dear friend Deeban pointed out that, hey, this porn thing is really killing you in a way. It's like slow death of all your dreams. And then I read the research from the book Your Brain on Porn, and I was just blown away by it, because the stories of people in that book was my story also. And when I stopped, I was able to really pursue what I always wanted to pursue, and work with you guys. And so uh, so yes, that's why I used to tell you that don't move meditation to your secondary activities, like you are doing that, and then you explained to me that something like it has become a routine, so you are moving it to your side goals. But uh, I would keep meditate. What happens is we become complacent when things are
Yeah.
going well. You are like, meditation, you know what, maybe I will not do it. I'll spend those 20 minutes doing something else. We become complacent, and then we fall into the ditch again. So that's the one thing that did I meditate today? Yes, I did. Good. I think I meditated for like 1.5 hours. So that's the one thing that can help out with this problem.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be. I need to schedule out my time better so that the functionality of meditation can be most effective. All right. Is that it?
Are you getting tired?
I think so. I'm kind of all talked out. I think from. I don't know if I can say anything more than what I've said currently. At least, it's always best to kind of end on a high note. So, I think I've gained a lot from this discussion, and I hopefully I've shared a lot that can be effective for others as well. But I don't know if there's anything more that I can really go on in on.
Okay, so I'll drop a message to Mr. Tyler then. All right. So, all right. Thanks for joining, because I tried to do it alone when you didn't come for first few minutes,
Okay.
and I was falling apart. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you to you said that we had a viewer, so that's cool. I'll probably, I don't know, I may listen back on this just to kind of formalize it, and I believe we will be, or at least we should be, kind of cutting up these discussions into more digestible bite-sized segments. So I have 2 segments from our last discussion, the 5-hour discussion, and I think there could be useful separation between like the topic of suffering as well as the topic of charity, or I don't know. I'll have to go through this, find where nice bite-sized clips can be useful for people.
Yeah.
All right. Pleasure talking to you. As for anyone that would like to join in on our discussions that we have on, well, it depends on where you are, but Fridays and Saturdays, depending on where you are, of course, Friday evenings to Saturday evenings. We have the Jordan B. Peterson.community website, and that has all of the links to the chat group where we kind of share the link for where you can take part in discussions much like this every weekend. So, and at multiple times too, since we're all kind of around the world, as you can see, we have many different timing schedules that can work for wherever you are. So, all right.
All right.
Goodbye.
And Merry Christmas.
Oh, yes, of course. And to you as well.
All right.